Looking to have your groceries delivered? Try Instacart. By following the link in the show notes, you can shop multiple stores, get the products you love from local stores, and get your delivery in as fast as 1 hour. Plus, Instacart highlights deals to save you money. And for our listeners, free delivery on your first order over $35. Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from ItalianGenealogy.blog, and I'm here today with Pat Zielinski, who's going to talk about researching her family from Calabria, Sicily, Salerno, and Puglia. So welcome, Pat. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Bob.
So my first question, Pat, is why and when did you start researching your family?
When was probably when I was about 10 or 12 years old. And why? I was trying to remember as a child. I just found it fascinating that all the kids I went to school with had these very well-spoken grandparents and parents, and my grandmother spoke very broken English. She never really assimilated, even though she came over as a child. And I started asking questions like, where were you born? And when did you come over here? And how did you meet Grandpa? And, I just found it fascinating. And so I've been asking questions really ever since. But I think as an adult, when it really happened for me to start actually documenting a lot of the stories I heard as a child was when I was expecting my first child. And my girlfriend gave me a little baby book, and you had to fill out your family tree. So I brought that to my grandmother, and I'm not sure. She apparently on that side was the one that must have given me more information. I think my grandfather tried to assimilate more. So I brought it to my grandmother, and I asked her to help me fill it out. And we have an amusing story as a result of that. But that's when I started. I want to say that was 1980.
Well, yeah, and I think like most of us, we all like to look at the old photo albums. I remember making my mother drag out the old book, had the black pages and the little tabs that you would slide the photos into, and I enjoyed that a lot as a kid. But let me ask you this. What did you discover that kind of jump-started your whole research process?
Well, it's a funny story. As I said, that my grandmother spoke broken English, and I believe she really could have spoken more American, if you wish, but I think she considered it a pride of her heritage that she slipped into Italian. And of course, she was from up in the hills above Sorrento, and every region of Italy has a different language, so her Italian was different slightly from my grandfather's. But anyways, we were filling out the family tree, and I asked her about her parents. She gave me all that information, and I actually have her passport coming over. I got that after she passed away, and I was able to verify that. And so then I asked her about my father's parents, and she said his name was Joseph Bava, and I forget if she gave the more Italian version of Joseph. And I said, okay. And I wrote down his birthday. And she didn't, I think at this time, she must have been probably early 80s, late 70s. So she didn't have all the facts. So she was giving me approximate. She knew the town he was born in, San Nicola, which is a little village outside of Caulonia, which is a very small town in the Reggio Calabria region, almost on the Ionian Sea there, very close. They have a marina. But anyways, so Joseph Bava and his date and time approximate. And I said, and who did he marry? And she said, he married Rosa Bava. And I said, yes, I know. When was she born? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, and what was her maiden name? Bava. I said, yes, Grandma, I know, assuming that she didn't quite get it, the English to Italian, whatever, what a maiden name went. And I said, but Grandma, what was her last name before she married Joseph? And she threw up her hands. Bava. It took me a minute, and I kind of stood there and said, you mean that Rosa Bava married a Joseph Bava? And she shrugged, that Italian way with the shoulders up and the hands. It was a small town. So I got a kick out of that. Apparently, it is not uncommon in arranged marriages in that time in the 1800s that the families would marry, cousins or second and third cousins. A person that I connected through Ancestry.com had told me that they did some research and that it probably was a second cousin because the church would have had to approve anything closer. But anyways, I'm telling this story to my brother later. He's listening to this, and his comment was, well, that explains a lot. So that was my first foray. And then, after we got all those names down and everything, there was another family in town with the same last name. And I asked her about that. And she said, oh, she just kind of shrugged it off. It's just a family. We're not close. They may be some kind of cousins. And it was a small-ish town that I grew up in. And I always wondered about that family. And when I was an adult and now and looking up through Ancestry.com and Facebook, and I connected with a woman who had the last name of Bava in Australia. We determined we weren't related, but is in the wonderful world of Ancestry. She connected me with someone else who said, I think you're related to my cousin. And I said, really? She said, yes, he went to school in Agawam. And so I'm like, I knew there was a family, but we were told we weren't related. Well, long story short, I did end up meeting this gentleman and his wife, and he filled in a lot of the missing pieces, which jogged my memory. His dad and my grandfather were brothers, and there was a parting of the way in the family with his dad and the rest of the family. Sort of tragic and sad, but just not uncommon in family. So his brother moved away to Texas or California, somewhere out west, because I remember him coming back once, and that was the big thing, that he was from out west. And so the families never met, and I would say we lived 1.5 miles from each other. He and his sister went to the same high school, a couple of years older than me, and we connected, 2 years ago at a restaurant here in Atlanta. And it was lovely to finally meet somebody who I would never have known about except for Ancestry.com and that DNA and all of that. So those are my 2 stories so far.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with PhilItaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. So I'll give you 2 interesting stories about my family. My father's uncle, he married his first cousin.
Okay.
And then when she passed away, he married her sister. So that's a very interesting story there. And they're not from a small town. They were from the big city, Naples. So there you go. And then on my mom's family, or from my and on my mom's side, my uncle was sleeping one time during the day because he worked at nights. And I don't know if it was a census taker or somebody came to the door to talk to my grandmother. And her name was Nicoletti. Her maiden name was Nicoletti. And my grandfather's name was Nicoletti, although they weren't related. So the person came to the door and asked my grandmother, what's your name? And she said Nicoletti. And then he said, well, what was your maiden name? And she said Nicoletti. And then he said, no, your name before you were married. And she said Nicoletti. And he said, no, I know your name is Nicoletti, but what's your name after you were married? And she said Nicoletti. And then finally my uncle yelled from the other room, she knows what you're talking about. My father's name was Nicoletti, and her maiden name was Nicoletti.
Oh, gosh. So funny.
So you mentioned Sorrento, the hills of Sorrento. So I'd like to ask you real quick about that because we were in Sorrento and actually stayed up in the hills overlooking Sorrento.
I know the hills of Sorrento, and if you could walk down to Sorrento, that was because we were there, I think it was 2017 or 2018. I meant to look it up. When we did our trip, which I'll tell you about, to visit all of my paternal and maternal grandparents' birthplaces, we did that. But when I say the hills, she was a little village called Brasigliano, I think close enough. And it's probably about 30 miles by horse cart. So it wasn't in those lovely hills that you saw. I'm guessing it was more, a little farm town or something.
So what was it like going and visiting the towns where your ancestors came from?
Well, it was really fascinating. Actually, what we did is my husband and I flew into Naples, and I had always said if I go to Italy, I'm going to go from one end to the other and eat and drink my way through Italy. And essentially, we did that. We landed in Venice and drove this trip I'll tell you about down to, I forget the name of the town, down near Messina, where we caught the ferry to Messina and so drove through all of Sicily. So my husband estimates that he drove, I don't know, 2,000 miles or something, 2,200 miles, I think he said. So it was fascinating. But so we did the Venice and Bologna and Florence. And then the whole point of the trip was to meet with my brother in Rome, who was coming over. So we met and picked up my brother in Rome to do the 4 towns, villages. So the first one was where we were just talking about Sorrento. She was actually born Salerno, which is south of Sorrento, and we went there as well. But Sorrento's a beautiful tourist area. It was very, I want to say almost moving because you just felt like you belonged. It was the food you knew, and the people looked like the people in your family, and it was very exciting. And my brother had his first cappuccino as soon as we picked him up, and he was like in heaven. you know. I think by the end of the trip, my brother said his taste buds like never knew they were alive until he went and ate in Italy. Food just never tasted so well. But we had a lovely trip going down the coast to a little town called Amantea, where we stayed in a converted monastery. And the gentleman there was a chef and made us this meal actually, it was my anniversary, and made a cake, and it was just lovely. And then we went over the hills, the Italian Alps, which was scary as heck because the first town, San Nicola, or the second actually, San Nicola, is on the other side of Sorrento and Salerno, as I said, more towards the Ionian Sea. And we had to get across. And my husband was bound and determined he was going to drive this whole trip. And they don't, first of all, you know how Italians drive. And then we were up on these high bridges over the mountain passes. People are flying by us. There is no breakdown lane, I guess you would call it. So it's just one lane going and one lane coming. God forbid somebody breaks down. I was just like, my eyes were closed. And then these little winding roads up to Caulonia first, which was the town where my grandfather's father registered the births and deaths and such at the church there. So that was our first stop. And we went into like a little convenience bus stop, pizzeria, and gelato place, all in one building with these lovely little ladies behind the counter. And I'm looking around, and I have enough Italian to get by in basics, but I was getting up my nerve to ask them. And this lady, I forget if it was my brother, I think it was my husband, she said, obviously we looked American. First of all, we're not dressed properly. And most of Italy, but especially in the smaller towns, men do not wear shorts or sandals. They are always dressed in slacks. Women wear dresses. We got a lot of looks. My brother would get looks when we would go into a restaurant, or my husband, because they were wearing shorts. And I wore some like pants, capris kind of thing, and the ladies were all in their dresses. And so obviously we stuck out and the minute we opened our mouth. So she asked my husband, and he said, well, my wife's family is from here, and the last name is Bava. And so she started speaking in Italian and calling over this other lady who spoke no English, and we were using my phone to translate. And come to find out, her aunt was a Bava, and she was trying to call them, and we never really got to connect with her. But what it taught me is even though I thought I had done all my homework, I really needed to try, and if I wanted to meet anybody, to make arrangements ahead of time. But it was lovely just to meet these people, and we got directions to San Nicola, which is way above this little town in Caulonia, where it was like almost a horse track getting up, or a donkey track. My husband's a great driver, but we had to turn around at one point and pull over at another when a car came down, and literally you just had to go into the woods or off the side of a cliff. It was really sketchy. And we got up there, and really the town, I mean, they had electrical wires going across, but you could see them dangling and hooked from one house to another. I don't want to say they were huts, but they were close to it. I mean, the Italians take old structures and build new ones onto them, which I think is wonderful, but in some cases, it just doesn't work. I think we were up there around noon, and there was just maybe one or two people out, and it was pretty deserted. We saw a couple of cats, and that was about it. And again, my brother, in his succinct way, turned to me and said, well, don't ever ask why they left Italy. And to some extent it was. You could see it was originally a farming, and also stonemasons, a lot of stone work there. And my great grandfather moved to West Virginia from that town because they went to work in the mines with whatever skills they had from working with the stones. So that was interesting. And then we made our way down and across Reggio Calabria, past the Puglia region to Massafra, where my maternal grandfather was born. And over the coast, as I said, to Messina, which we took the ferry over, which was great. And if anybody ever has a chance to do that, I would just say do it, because it's really fun. And you hit Messina, and then there's some beautiful towns along that coast of Sicily. And we spent a night in a hotel, celebrated my husband's birthday, headed down to the last stop. Now, this has been going on over this trip, I think, over 2 weeks at this point, because we're stopping in hotels and eating along the way. So we wanted to see Mount Etna. And let me see, we would have taken a right, if my directions are good, and headed inland. And we got to Etna reasonably okay. We got stuck in some little market, and that was fun trying to get out of that. Because we're driving where you're really not supposed to be driving. We got to Mount Etna and there's some nice wineries there, but we kind of had a schedule, because at that time we only had 2 days and we had to fly home. And decided somehow, for lack of a better word, to head inland for what we thought, quote unquote, was the shorter route based on Google directions, and literally ended up on a cow path, which only oncoming traffic we saw were cows. So got stuck in some olive groves, long, starry, short. We managed to get out of there, find a highway, and head our way to Palermo. And Palermo's an interesting city. It definitely still has some areas you kind of don't want to walk at night, but it's beautiful. It's on the water. So we stayed in the harbor. And as with all of Italy, when you go to dinner, if you're having seafood and you're eating on the coast, you basically pick out the squid or the octopus or the fish you want, and they cook it for you. So we did that and had a great meal. In fact, back to when my husband's birthday was back in Messina, I had arranged for a little dinner. We had hoped to have it on the water, but it rained that night, so the four of us ate inside. And I had asked the chef to do a menu ahead of time, which we talked about when I was in America. And so when I checked into the hotel, I got a phone call from the concierge asking me if I wanted to see my fish, because I had asked if possible to have sea bass. I said, I beg your pardon. He said, your fish is here. Would you like to look at it before the chef prepares it? And I don't think this is uncommon in Italy. This is how important their food is to them and how local they eat. If they can tell you where the tomatoes came from, and the cheese is usually down the street or another farm, and the wine is from a cooperative. And that's what, as my brother says, makes your taste buds sing. Everything is just warm from the earth and fresh from the sea, and it's just amazing food. And so I said to the gentleman on the phone that I was sure the chef had picked me out a good fish, and I trusted him. Because we also had a lot of other things to do, and I was afraid my husband, this was going to be all a surprise for him, that he was asking me why I was going to look at a fish in the middle of the afternoon. So it was presented that night encrusted in salt, where the waiter came over and cracked the salt and exposed and served the fish, which was fun. So yeah, it was a great trip. It was a wonderful trip. I'll never forget it. And we've been over a number of times since for different areas. We stayed in a week or two in Tuscany. But that one stands out just because I felt like I was connecting to my roots.
We'll be right back.
Lafayette, we are here. The French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman. Learn all about France's fascinating history, its great characters like Charlemagne, Joan of Arc, Louis XIV, or Napoleon, but also the great events that marked France, Europe, and sometimes the whole world. Lafayette, we're here. Available wherever you get your podcast or on LafayettePodcast.com. À bientôt.
So, Pat, I know you have an interesting story about the origins of the Bava family name.
There was a recipe in Hartford Current, 1989 or 90s, and it was called gnocchi alla bava. So, of course, just as your name is Sorrentino, which I would assume the origins of your family on that side are from Sorrento or something related to it, because of the, how they did the origins of the names. And this lady who had this recipe was from Italy, and I managed to track her down and call her and ask her and say, I loved your recipe, but my last name is Bava, blah, blah, blah. And she said to me, well, do you know what Bava means? And I said, no. She said, it means stringy drool. I went, lovely, really? And she said, and that's why that recipe was made with 4 different Italian cheeses. And when you pulled out the gnocchi, it just had like stringy cheese. And it is funny. And so, I've read more stories about, yes, there are people that, were named for different physical attributes, or where they were born, or at the time they were born.
So one of the interesting things that I found, especially with my grandmother's family that owned land, if you were the family, your name was Piromalo. But if you worked on the land and you took the name of the count or the duke or whatever, your name would be Piromali. So more or less of the family, I guess.
Isn't that something, how they did that?
So, Pat, do you know what it was like for your ancestors to come to the United States, as far as journeying by sea, or how they got to the port?
I researched, how they came across. I have found that my paternal grandmother, the one who helped me fill out my family tree, she came over on the Bavaria boat out of Naples. But when I went to this little town where my grandfather was born, and I call it a town, but it really is just a village or a bunch of houses. And to see what we had to do to drive, they had to come by donkey cart over the Italian Alps and then down into the area of Amantea, another town on that coast, and then they had to take like a cog railway over to Naples. I mean, it was just unbelievable before they ever even got out of Italy. And you wonder at the courage of all of our ancestors to have picked up and said goodbye, to their parents and their grandparents, sometimes their wives and children, if there were men going over ahead of time to make a life, and just pick up and go. You think about it now, would we have had the kind of moral fortitude and courage that these folks did? But seeing, some of these locations in Palermo, I don't know what my grandmother's living conditions were, but certainly seeing my grandfather's, even now, this was just a few years ago that we went, 2016, I think it was, and to see how they were still living was, really eye-opening.
Both my mom and dad's family came around the same time, about 1915. And I know why my mom's family came, because they were pretty poor, and my grandfather had fought in the war in Libya, and World War II was breaking out, and my grandmother didn't want him to go back into the army. And when they came, they left my oldest uncle there in the care of his grandparents. And he didn't see his mom and dad for 45 years, nor did he ever meet any of his brothers and sisters. My dad's family, I'm not sure why they came. The only thing I know was that her aunt had come in 1905, so it's quite possible that they had convinced her or talked to her and told her that she could make a life here that was better than what they had in Italy. But, she didn't come from a poor family. Her family were relatively wealthy, I guess, in the scheme of things.
I want to say they came over 1902, 1900, something, 1890, somewhere around there. And she talked about the mafia, if the mafia didn't get it, the government did. So, I mean, I don't know if there was a lot of taxation or a lot of, that type of thing levied on people with money. My grandparents did not, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, at that time, that was before, wasn't it before Italian unification? So they were all like separate little.
No, well, Italian unification came in 1860.
Okay, 1860. Okay.
No, actually, they didn't. Or as far as I know, they didn't, because when I look back at the records, it still shows on some of the birth records that they were, or their occupation was either a rich person in some cases landowner.
But that's the fascinating part of genealogy and ancestry that keeps me hooked, is because you want to know, you want to know why, the whys of what people did. And it's just, on my husband's side, they're on his mother's side, they're all old New England families that people have already connected to, and it's been really easy to link up. And in fact, one of his ancestors, not to divulge into Yankee ancestry, but one of his, I think it was his great grandfather, had already applied to be a son of the Patriots, is it? Or something similar. It's
Sons
like
and daughters of the American Revolution.
Yes, yes. So his great grandfather, they had already done all the work, because you have to prove that your ancestor, your direct male ancestor, had fought in the Revolution on the right side, not the Tories. And this gentleman had, and they were all sea captains up in Boston. And they had land, and we're wondering what happened to all this land and outside of Boston, and why isn't it still in the family? And you just want to know all these questions. And I think someday when I have the time, I'd still like to dig in more on both sides, but it is fascinating.
So both my children are adopted, and my daughter actually is a descendant of both Captain Morgan and Daniel Boone. So, Pat, how have you been finding the records? Have you been looking online? Have you researched with some help from people over in Italy?
If you're lucky enough, you can find the information. The problem is in Italy, after a certain period of time, you actually have to physically go over there. And you can't even just go into the church where most of the records are. You have to make an appointment, hope that, they'll be there when you get there, and you have to physically go through all the records. There's a family that I met on the same Facebook page that you and I were chatting on. And the young lady's name is Carrie, and she has been doing a lot of research, and she found out we were related, like distant by 5 separations. And I kept saying, no, I don't think so. But she's got a network of people that have been pouring through those as soon as they get the archived records available on the internet. And she was able to give me some information. And in fact, we are distantly related. And her and her cousins were planning, like you, a trip over in the fall. And I think they're going to delay that as well. But it's amazing with the DNA too, the DNA testing, what you find out. But it's just not as easy as somebody of English or Scottish descent, where you still physically can get to those records, most of which are online.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I found lots of records online, but before 1809, there's not much out there, and I'm dying to get my hands on some church records, and hopefully when we go, maybe visit a few churches and do that. But I wanted to ask you also, where did you stay when you were in Italy and researching the family?
We stayed in a really nice resort before we went up into Caulonia in Reggio Calabria to do our Bava history. Basically, I couldn't find any place to stay in the town. I think now, having been there, maybe we would have been a little braver to try a little B&B, not even B&B, an Airbnb. I don't think they had anything else there. But at the time, I'm like, this is my brother's first time over. Let's just go stay somewhere where we know at the end of the day we can get a nice meal and relax and not have to worry about if they even have internet or anything. So we did our thing. And speaking of food, we had this meal in this wonderful restaurant where they make a it was known for its steaks. And so we had this wonderful meal, and they grilled outside. It was a very cool restaurant. As we were driving out, we could see the cattle still out in the field. And Doc, kind of felt bad after having that wonderful meal. But I digress for a minute there. But as our last morning there, we're having our cappuccinos, and this barista came out and talked with us, and because he had recommended the restaurant. And did you like it? Oh my gosh, yes. And they made this wonderful little liqueur, which we bought, which I cannot get any more of, literally outside of that area of Calabria. And so why are you here? He said. And we said, we're researching our family. My grandfather, Bava, lived up in the hills. And he said, my last name is Bava. And it was like, I can't believe this. We've been here for 3 days. We never connected. Very nice young man. And I don't know if we were related because, that we had to get going and, it was just kind of cool. Yeah, but you should bring. I never thought to do that. And I didn't have enough of my my background. I just had the very basic names. But this could be your second or third cousin, and unless you really know all the family, which again, because my grandparents came over and were kind of secretive about anybody else that that other family, I really just didn't have the tools to be able to kind of connect the dots, but it was fun. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's funny. Well, I had not even, I would say, similar because it was so far removed. But the first time I went to Italy, I went alone on business, and I was up in the northern part of Italy, in Milan, for business. And I, on my own weekend, on my own between meetings, I took the train to Venice, which was just overwhelming to just see this city that I'd heard about. And on the way back, I was going to be had to fly back through the Milan airport, and they were having in their center gallery there a little almost like a little mini trade show, highlighting the region specialties of the Asti region, which is chocolates and wine and that type of thing. And I was walking by, and there was Bava wine. I'm like, oh my gosh, Bava wine. So I bought a couple of bottles and stuffed them in my briefcase on the way out, which I think you're allowed to take 2 or 3, so I was okay. um, and then I researched the Bava winery when I got back home, and it's an old winery outside of Torino where they supply the wine to the Vatican, the Santo wine, the sacred wine, and they also have other champagnes and red and white wines. And so I, brazenly sent off an email saying, "Hi, I'm a Bava too." Never heard back from them because it's probably they probably get a lot of emails from people trying to connect. And I doubt we're related because so far removed from where my Bava relatives started. But it's interesting, to find where all these branches, and I have to think at one point they were all related, but so distantly, now. Hmm. I know. I know. I know. You have to wonder. The first Baba, what did he or she look like that they said, "Oh, there's Mr. Drooly," and there. I mean, I can't remember now, but I was reading some of the stories of the origins of some of the names, and it was like, oh my goodness. Um, so what it does tell me is that in those Godfather movies and The Sopranos, where they talk about Joey One Eye, or all those kind of names, that's kind of how they named people. you know if you had a limp, your name had something to do with the fact that you didn't walk properly.
Yeah, that's true. And I found it amazing as I was researching the history of Italian names. There's over 300,000 Italian surnames, and that's part of the reason they name physical disabilities, physical characteristics, where they came from, almost anything that you could think of.
So did you do DNA? You said you've done your DNA testing.
Yes, I did. I actually did two. I did one with Ancestry.com, of course. And then I also did Living DNA. And the difference between the two is Ancestry gives you a whole lot of cousin matches because there are so many people who have signed on to that. Living DNA doesn't have as many cousin matches, although they're starting to pick up. But what they do is they give you your maternal and paternal lines, which is great. And it traces you back, anywhere from 10,000 to maybe 30,000 years, and shows the migration paths. So that's really interesting. And then one other thing that I did, which is pretty cool, is My True Ancestry. And you could send your results from either one of those companies and several others. And what they do is they match your DNA back to archaeological digs, which is really great because it goes back, in some cases, I think almost 50,000 years. And they match haplogroups and show you what royalty you may be related to, and also give you the history of those groups. So that's all pretty neat. So I would suggest to anybody who's done a test, if you want to have some great directional things to show people where you may come from, send your stuff to My True Ancestry. And I actually did a couple of reviews on the blog about them. And also, while I thought I knew most of my cousins, I did find some interesting things out there about, finding third and even fourth cousins that, I obviously knew their parents or their grandparents. So that was pretty interesting.
I actually haven't connected as much as I should with the people that I did the DNA testing with. I was more concerned proving my heritage, if you will, and kind of seeing. I always joked a little bit about that some of my relatives came across the Mediterranean Sea. And sure enough, as well the Ionian Sea, because it showed, just in addition to the southern Italy, it showed some Greek, which is understandable because Caulonia was actually spelt with a K and was originally settled by the Greeks. And before them, oh gosh, my history is horrible, but not only that, but besides Greek, in Sicily's been conquered by just about everybody due to its strategic location. And so it did show that I had some North African and some Turkish blood, if you will, heritage in my DNA, which makes a lot of sense. But I haven't actually. And in the beginning, because I did this a number of years ago, I probably need to do it again. I kind of was like, oh, this can't, these links, they can't be really true. But as soon as I went on and saw, it linked me to my first cousin who had done a DNA testing. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is really, again, I think it was 10 years ago. Maybe I've done it, or maybe 8 or so. So I haven't done 23andMe or any of those yet. But then you start looking at all these people and you're thinking, how am I related to these people? And I haven't done into that at all. I've just been, focused on the people that I know in my little bubble, if you will, of family. But it'll be interesting to see if I unearth any skeletons. Although we already have enough. I mean, so what's a few more?
Yeah, and I was lucky in that through Facebook, as I was able to connect to several of the Piramalo and Caracciolo third and fourth cousins. Never really knew existed, so that was really pretty neat. And I just wish more people in Italy would do the DNA test. And I was interviewing somebody the other day who said he actually brought some tests with him. So that's something I'm considering on doing when I go. Well, Pat, I appreciate you taking the time, and this has been a lot of fun, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, great. It was fun for me, too, and I look forward to hearing more about your family as well and listening to your podcasts. I found them interesting.
Thanks for listening. Follow us on Facebook in the Italian Genealogy group or at www.italiangenealogy.blog.